Hello, back in time with Rick Clunn again, and this we're in the January 1975, and it's kind of an interesting issue when I was going back and looking through it because it's mostly about smallmouth, and smallmouth really did not play a big role in tournament fishing in the early years. We didn't fish a lot of places that had them. So I found it interesting that they put so much emphasis on this magazine on smallmouth. This actual cover was done by a really, amazing painter out of Tennessee back then, uh, Mark McDonald, Ralph McDonald. I can't see without my glasses, but and he in this basically he painted that cover and a lot of other things for bass later on. But there were some interesting things here. So they're even kind of qualifying why they're doing the smallmouth in this issue a little bit, because who's considered kind of the starting this ideal and writing the first book on Micropterus alamotus, the largemouth bass, was Dr. James Henshaw, and. But he did in this say, I'm going to read it. Wow, somebody leaving? Anyway, all of the axioms of fishing, none is more famous than Dr. James Henshaw's pronouncement of the black bass. Inch for inch and pound for pound, the game fish that swims. Henshaw, although he did not make this distinction, apparently was referring to the smallmouth. Truly the black bass with a fighting heart. And that's really was the thing that separated the smallmouth from the black bass. Even my first experiences with it was it fought a lot harder than a largemouth. So and nowadays, we have a lot of artists that have come into the world of bass fishing and done some incredible work. But as you will see here, almost all of the articles in here were on the smallmouth, and the smallmouth was not stocked in most lakes. Man-made impoundments, and it really was lakes that was impounded, taking in rivers and streams that had a resident, native. Population of smallmouth, and over time they actually started, and it took a long time. They started like Table Rock and some of these lakes. In the beginning, you never saw smallmouths in bull shows and other lakes in the country, and but finally they started populating the lake enough that they're a significant fish to fish for now. Of course, the north is really where they're famous now. Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence River, Lake St. Clair, and they're definitely playing a gigantic role in the world of bass fishing now. And he actually goes through a bunch of the river systems and the lakes and rivers they were in. Dale Hollow was where the world record came from, and I believe it's still where the world record comes from. Billy Westmoreland, really, he guided it there. He was a tournament angler. He's the one that pulled, Johnny Morris out of the lake in Beaver Lake in that storm where his boat sunk, and he was determined to break the world record. Somebody else did. And this is Billy right here, and here's some of the more famous smallmouth fishermen back in that time frame. Billy was a big guy. He was a finesse fisherman. He fished a lot of little hair jigs and things and hair flies for the smallmouth techniques that most of us are not even familiar with. And again, I live on the smallmouth stream here now in Missouri. I should say it's Bryant Creek. But it's a beautiful stream. There's no cities on it. And the number one fish in this stream is smallmouth. And it's mostly floatable kayaks now. You go up and down it quite a bit, but still you don't see many except on the holidays. So it's really a very pristine body of water.
I'm going to let the dog in because he's scratching on the door.
We got a dog that wants to be part of the show, so we're letting him in.
Sorry.
And this is just kind of cute. There's a lot of lakes back then, and still are a few like this, where big outboards are not allowed. So they come up with all these outboards of a certain power. And these were, believe it or not, some of the first electric engines that they actually put on aluminum boats to be able to move around in those lakes that normally you could not. They're, first electric motors, basically. Some of these places we actually have tournaments on now. This was the Sabine River down in Orange, Beaumont areas. Of course, here's, again, a mention of solar lunar tables, and anglers have always trying to learn more ways to understand their natural environment and what really control the activity of the fish and game, and all hunters use it a lot. It's still, to me, in my observation, it's still a very inexact science, because when most solar lunar tables people read, it's moon phases more than anything else, it's only one of the variables. It can be offset by other variables. In other words, if you have a great area in the back of a creek, and you definitely want to fish your great areas, you want to be aware of the major minor feeding periods. But all of a sudden, okay, the major feeding period is 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to be back in there. But it rained all night and the creek muddied up. Well, that variable is going to offset the solar lunar variable. Also dams nowadays, when they release water and run water through, it's a very powerful variable, and movement in the lake, activates the fish, even when necessarily it's not a perfect moon phase. I'm just reading this. This I found kind of unique. Basically, because solar lunar tables fish tide, it is a tidal effect, and we're very aware of it in the saltwater areas. But I've always believed, and still believe, that there's tidal effects in creeks. I can walk down to my little side creek, and there'd be 1 inch of water there, when I walk down there in the morning, and then I can come back in the middle of the day and it's no water there. And then you come back 6 hours later and it's water again. I think the tides are affected even in these underground rivers and streams and stuff. And this was an interesting note. It's a guy, the director of the New York Aquarium. He insisted notice that the clams, which were on exhibition in his aquarium, buried themselves in the sand in their glass boxes at the same exact time of low tide in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, this is in an aquarium. So that obviously a clam's going to try, when he knows there's not going to be any water over him, maybe on low tide, he's going to bury himself in the sand. And then of course the reverse would happen. On a high tide, he would come out of the sand and be more in. So it's an interesting science. I wish I had spent more time on it, like a lot of things in my fishing career. I think Stan Fagerson, he was a writer from out north, but he did more to try to teach people how to cast correctly than any of the. I've mentioned him multiple times in going back in time, but it's just no, he did a lot in that to help anglers really understand the correct way to hold an open. I mean, the common reel nowadays is a casting reel, okay? And when I started fishing, I'd cast like this and leave the handle basically parallel to the earth. But what that causes is a lot of overspin when you, especially if you're not smooth. If you're jerky, then you create a lot of overspin, and that's where a lot of your backlashes come from. Stan said, you know, turn your handle on either, depending on which left-handed or right-handed, point your handle toward the sky. So when you cast, the line is whipping sideways on the spool and not directly on the spool. And this will really gain you more control because you were controlling it with your thumb. And I'll show you where he's demonstrating that, and that's why I tried to explain it to begin with, is because he, you know, right here is where he's really trying to see his handles pointed toward the sky, not parallel to the earth. And that makes a really big difference when you're casting to avoid controlling the smoothness of the spool and not getting a lot of backlashes. Probably my first crankbait was a hellbender that I ever threw. I threw it in my bass club days, and that's really what got me hooked on how effective crankbaits were. And a lot of people say, well, what was the first, nowadays we call them Cordell spots or rattle traps. Actually, it was a bio boogie type bait, and that's been forgotten about. Oh, Al Linder here. He was really, I'm going to go on because there's actually in a later issue, but he was one of the first northern anglers that actually came down. Everybody nowadays associates it with Kevin Van Dam when he came down from the north, because we thought these guys really are not going to do as good as us southern boys because we fish 12 months out of the year. We got 6 months more experience than they do, because their lakes up there were frozen half the year. And so, but he came down and he was really, to me, Roland gets a lot of, and deservedly so, the science mentality. He gets a lot of credit for that in bass fishing, the art and science, and I followed that a lot. But then when Al came along with the End Fisherman magazines, they were by far the best written subject matter on the science of fishing, and very, very, very good. If you ever get a chance to look back and get some of those End Fishermen, they are really worth looking at. Then he got smallmouth bass state records and all of that, and I noticed that Texas doesn't even see, this is what I said early on, even though Texas has some good smallmouth lakes now, but it just came from the native creek fish that eventually have spawned enough and increased their population enough to be significant. Texas didn't even have a record on smallmouth at this time. And again, here's Al winning. He won like, you know, multiple tournaments, even in his time frame. And most people probably, I know the young anglers probably don't really know about Al, but he was really one of the people that, all of us are products of people. Every angler out there, whether he admits it or not, is a product of those that came before him. And in some cases, he may not even know who they are. It was a style this angler had that he adapted. But in most cases, you know, we're all products of. So even if you don't know the guy, you might ought to learn a little bit about him, because you might find, because Al was one of the first spinning rod, light line guys. He was kind of like Tom Mann. He used a lot of open face spinning reels, which most anglers did not do back then. And nowadays it's very common. Almost everybody has 4 or 5 open face spinning reels laying on their deck. So that's January 1975.